Hi, my name is Matt Jones. Thanks for joining me today. I am going to be talking about the responsibility of translation in science writing and the importance of being a productive skeptic. So, as science writers, what we're often faced with when encountering original scientific research, whether in the form of a published study or article, is the challenge of how to translate highly specialized language and processes into something that is accessible and compelling to a general readership. In fact, this is one of the main responsibilities of being a science writer, working as a kind of translator, someone who can explain and demystify topics that readers are otherwise unfamiliar with. Take, for instance, what science writer Ed Yong has to say about how to explain complex topics. Mathematicians will round numbers to various decimal places, treating 2.343839 as 2.3 for the sake of simplicity. Accuracy is lost, but acceptably so. In a similar way, good science writing rounds technical concepts to their nearest understandable form. So ultimately, the bottom line, or at least one of the bottom lines in science writing, is that you explain complex ideas in a simple way, rather than explaining simple ideas in a complex way. However, as a science writer, you are responsible for more than the act of explaining a complex idea in a way that is understandable. After all, what if the very thing you've explained is somehow incorrect? What if that technical concept you've rounded off to its nearest understandable form is somehow flawed? This leads me to that second responsibility of being a science writer, the other bottom line, moving beyond translation by maintaining a healthy sense of skepticism. It sounds obvious, but it's worth saying. Science is a human endeavor, and as Alexander Pope once said in his essay on criticism, to err is human, which is all to say that science and the scientific process is imperfect. People, even scientists, make mistakes. For instance, while the peer review process is meant to control for rigor, it does not guarantee that the methods or results of any given scientific study are foolproof. Part of this has to do with the simple fact that there are not enough reviewers to devote enough time to thoroughly vet the claims of the millions of scientific papers that are published each year. Consider in December 2014 Michael LaCour's study, When Contact Changes Minds, an experiment on transmission of support for gay equality. This study, which examined how canvassers could change voters' minds, made it past peer review and into the pages of the prestigious academic journal Science. However, this paper was later retracted in May 2015 after the data in the study was found to have been forged to fit the findings LaCour most desired. This is perhaps also obvious, but science is a process. Hypotheses must be formulated, predictions made, and experiments carried out, all while adhering to particular procedural methods and protocols before any sort of conclusion can be reached. However, just because a conclusion is reached, and just because that conclusion makes it past the peer review process and into the pages of a scientific journal, doesn't mean the process is over. Take, for instance, the 2011 article, Feeling the Future: Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. This particular study was authored by Daryl Bem, a professor emeritus at Cornell University with a long and distinguished history in the field of social psychology. It appeared in the pages of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, a highly regarded, top-tier, peer-reviewed scientific journal published by the American Psychological Association. Bem's study provided statistical evidence that ESP, otherwise known as extrasensory perception, otherwise known as second sight or precognition, was real. There was just one problem. His findings weren't reproducible. A year later, the same journal that originally published Bem's article also published Correcting the Past: Failures to Replicate Psi, in which 4 researchers found no evidence of the existence of precognition. This meant that if you were a science writer in 2011 and you perfectly translated the methodology and findings of Bem's study, then you would have arrived at his same conclusion. that ESP was real, even though it wasn't. Bem's paper ended up launching a sort of crisis within the field of social psychology at large, not necessarily because of its findings, but because it utilized conventional methods and protocols to arrive at results that were essentially impossible. Following Bem's study, the British journal Biomed Central attempted to replicate 100 psychology studies, 39 of which were successfully confirmed, while 43 were ultimately retracted. Of course, the scientific process is not only affected by things like study design. Science is a process constantly being pushed and pulled by the forces of other external processes like politics and fundraising. In fact, the way research is funded and who provides the funding can affect everything from study design to the very findings of a particular piece of science. Consider even a study from within the last month, led by 3 well-credentialed scientists and researchers from the Stanford University School of Medicine. The study, titled COVID-19 Antibody Seroprevalence in Santa Clara County, California, made headlines around the world precisely because of what its findings indicated, that COVID-19 mortality projections were overblown by a large margin. This paper was released as an unrefereed preprint, which means that it was made publicly available before the official peer review process, thereby allowing other scientists to comment on and discuss the findings. And discuss they did. In fact, both the study's design and statistical analysis were immediately critiqued by other experts in the field, so much so that researchers released a revision 2 weeks later. However, issues with this particular study and its methodology were just the beginning. Later, as reported by BuzzFeed, a Stanford whistleblower complaint revealed a potential conflict of interest in the Stanford University study. It had been funded in part by the founder of JetBlue Airways, a vocal proponent of ending statewide lockdowns and reopening the economy. This reveal essentially cast the study's findings into doubt. Science reportage of an ongoing pandemic is perhaps one of the greatest reminders that science is itself a process. Each new published study is a living document, a single provisional data point in that process. This proves to be particularly true in light of COVID-19 coverage, during which at least 6 published studies have been officially retracted, according to the source Retraction Watch, which functions as a database that brings together more than 18,000 retracted papers and conference abstracts going as far back as the 1970s. This is why translation is just one of the responsibilities of a science writer. After all, erroneous findings, whether conveyed with technical jargon or in layman's terms, are still erroneous. Of course, this isn't to say that you should distrust all science as a science writer. In fact, if you are doing science writing, you're probably for some reason doing it because you're delighted by science itself and the way it works. So there are ways to be a productive skeptic. For instance, instead of just translating or summarizing the language of a scientific study, report out the science itself. In the same way a political reporter would research and verify a claim made by a politician, so too should a science writer do the same for findings in a study. Interview and reach out to not only the authors of the study, because as I mentioned before, scientists can have their own biases and desires that affect their research, but also reach out to relevant experts in the field. Writers, just like scientists, can't be experts in everything, so it's important to talk to credible sources who can vet and evaluate any research that is a central factor in the story you're writing. Consider Daryl Bem's groundbreaking ESP example. Shortly before its publication in 2011, the New York Times ran an article in which the journalist not only explained Bem's study and its findings, but also interviewed other prominent experts to provide context for how the study was being both supported and critiqued. In this way, the New York Times article was not just about translating Bem's findings, but it was also about contextualizing them within the response of the larger social psychology community. In fact, the article was quick to point out that Bem's research outraged a lot of other experts in the community. When you're writing about a scientific study, or a scientist's original research, it's also crucial to look beyond the data, the methodology, and the findings. In fact, you want to research the people doing the research, the scientists. Ask, who is funding the study, and are there any conflicts of interest? It's important, again, to think of every published paper as a living document, alive within the context of history and politics and culture. This is especially true of COVID-19 coverage, in which the pressure to find quick science-based solutions, coupled with economic and political turmoil, all have the ability to contort the process of truth-finding, as well as the truth itself, as demonstrated in BuzzFeed's investigative reporting on the Stanford University COVID-19 study. It is the responsibility of a science writer to not only clearly communicate complex ideas, but before the writing even begins, to vet the very foundations and conditions which brought those ideas into being. When I talk about being a skeptic or a productive skeptic, I'm essentially talking about researching and evaluating sources, particularly when those sources, or even when those sources, come directly from a scientist's original research. Skepticism is, after all, ultimately a good thing, both for science and the people writing about it. I've included some additional sources on this last slide. If you want to read more about some of the readings and studies and articles that I mentioned, these are also all really useful sources to further explain the importance of skepticism in the writing process and in the research process. Thank you for joining me today.